for this week, week 10, question mark, 10 of Zoom chats. We've been doing this for a couple months now. We're going to be talking today with Andy Kopietz of Good Done Daily, talking a little bit about branding and what that means to Good Done Daily, and hopefully you as well. If you're joining us from Facebook or Twitter or YouTube, feel free to comment on those channels, and we'll make sure to get your questions, comments over to the Zoom webinar. But if you're joining us here in Zoom, make sure to comment, tell us where you're joining us from. After Andy does the presentation, we'll have some time for Q&A, so make sure to use that Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we start. First, we put on these talks for free for the benefit of you and the community, and I also want to make sure that we use this time to also shout out a couple other local organizations that you should consider supporting. So if you like what we're doing here, consider a donation in our honor at a couple of these organizations. I'm going to talk a little bit about them. There's first the Detroit Justice Center, which is a nonprofit law firm working alongside communities to create economic opportunities, transform the justice system, and promote equitable and just cities. They're a great organization and also work with the bail.org, which is running the kind of a nationwide bail fund to stop or at least help people who are caught in the predatory bail system. There's also Michigan Liberation, which is a statewide network of people and organizations organizing to end the criminalization of Black families and communities of color in Michigan. We envision a state without mass incarceration or mass policing. Doing a lot of great work there, so make sure to also support them. There's the Michigan Solidarity Bail Fund, which is a bail fund that is specifically geared towards being those most in need and those who put themselves at risk fighting for our collective freedom. They're helping out people who have been caught and arrested due to protesting or any sort of political action. So definitely important in this time to consider. And then finally, it is Pride Month, and I want to shout out one of my personal favorites, the Ruth Ellis Center, which is a center dedicated to LGBTQIA plus youth and young adult with an emphasis of young people of color who are experiencing homelessness, involved in the child welfare system, or experiencing barriers to their health and well-being. They do a lot of great work in the city. And I really recommend you show them some support this month. They always do great work. And then one other thing to note, Donna Jackson of DMJ Studios has two poster exhibitions coming up that close submissions on August 1st. There's posters on politics, which is about general political happenings. It's been going on since 2017. So definitely, if you got some cool ideas, make sure to head over there and submit. There's also the World After, which is talking about envisioning a post COVID-19 world and what that means. So if you have some design ideas, make sure to head over to dmjstudio.com for some more info. So with that being said, I'm gonna take it over to Andy here and make sure that you can share a screen and we can get started.
Sure.
Is that all good?
Yeah, let me. I unshared it for a second. So
oh yeah, no problem. I realized I wasn't sharing my screen at all during any of that, so I hope you enjoyed looking at my face while I was talking about it instead of the things that I was trying to be showing.
Oh no! Do you need to go back and share the slides, or?
Yeah, I'll post them shortly. Okay. But Leslie asked for the links. It's dmjstudio.com, and I'll post that in chat as well for you.
Okay, it happens to the best of us.
Yeah,
here we go. I'm going to share my screen real quick.
Go for it.
Does that come through okay?
Yeah, looking good. All right. Well, thank you, Andy. I'll head it on over to you to talk.
Well, thank you, Dylan, and thank you, Maria, who's also here but is silent and kind of in the background. It's really nice to be asked to come back and talk to everybody. I I really appreciate the opportunity. And again, it's always nice to help to build and contribute to this community of graphic designers that we have both here in Metro Detroit and in other parts of the country who might be watching this. So, whatever you take away from this, happy to share our perspective, and maybe you will gain some tips or tricks for how you will conduct work in your own corner of the world. So my name is Andy Kopietz, and I run a graphic design studio here in Hamtramck, which is a smaller municipality inside of Detroit, Michigan. And we are called Good Done Daily. We tend to work with a lot of mission-driven organizations. So these are folks like nonprofits, foundations or philanthropies, local governments or cities, economic development initiatives, social enterprises, and a lot of grassroots community development or small arts and culture initiatives in the city and on other parts of Southeast Michigan as well. And this is just this is a slide of some of our recent projects. We've been involved with everything from the communications design work for the city of Detroit with a trio of other urbanists and consultants, basically thinking about the redesign of the city's 100-year-old master transportation plan. So that's what you see over here in Streets for People. We've done exhibitions for the city of Detroit. There was one down in the lower corner about the about vacant land use and different archetypes of land in Detroit that we worked on with the city's planning and development department. We've worked on toolkits and guides for foundations that take a look at the impacts and the future of the caregiving system and what that means to care for an aging population of adults in a really under-resourced world. And we've even done signage and different projects for small community associations and in and around Detroit. So, just a few examples of our work and kind of what our aesthetic outlook and projects look like. And so I'm going to kind of navigate away from this because this is not the point of this talk, I guess. The point of this talk is, as the description for this Zoom meeting probably said, branding. And I think for us, and maybe to a lot of you, branding means different things to all of us. It can mean the way that people are influenced to care about the things that you sell, whether it's a product, tool, or a service. It can be how you refer to yourself. I think for me, branding is really, you can sort of imagine branding as like, say you are looking around for a new dentist and you call a few dentist offices and you speak with somebody and they just give you this really negative impression over the phone. And you're like, man, I don't think I'm going to be going there. And they could be completely fine, intelligent, awesome dentists who would do a great job with your mouth or whatever. But because they treated you poorly in that moment, that's sort of a reflection of their brand. They're stewarding the brand. And so how they made you feel in that moment is going to impact how you feel about the company in general. So I like to think about branding from that very simple lens. Like it's how you're conveying information, how you're making people feel. Not the same you look visually. It's not a logo. It's not a pair of great typefaces or fonts. It's not your colors or the kind of pattern systems. All of that helps to create the core of your identity, but it's not your brand. The brand is really this emotional sauce that's baked into the work as a whole. And so, just even Googling the term branding yields a lot of different results, right? There's a lot of different ways that you can think about it, all of it very varied and nuanced. And so, these are many other ways that people can think about it. But I don't know if I'm really going to talk so much about branding as I am about like when you brand an organization or a company, how are you selling that work? How are you pitching it to people? How are you conveying it and explaining it to a client in a way that they're going to understand and maybe feel delighted by and curious by, and maybe even that they'll adopt and choose the concept, whatever concept you're showing them. And so I think this presentation is a little bit more about how I've gone about presenting our work to our clients and maybe some of the issues and errors that I made in doing that. And in kind of pulling back the veil a little bit, maybe you can learn from how we do things and what to do and maybe what not to do. So I'm gonna get that started and talk a little bit about our client, Atlantic Impact. This is what they used to look like when they first came to us, and they had looked this way for several years. They're a Detroit-based nonprofit, and what they do is they take youth, Detroit youth and adolescents, on experiential trips to different parts of the world. So it could be Barbados, it could be Spain, it could be the UK. Often these are kids, just youth that are in and around the city that have never left the confines of the. In fact, I've never even been to the 1 square mile radius of the central business district, which is the heart, the downtown of Detroit. A lot of them sort of live in outerline communities in the city and have a kind of limited range of experiences. And so I think what Atlantic Impact tries to do is raise the bar of achievement and expectations for youth and students by taking them to other parts of the world, giving them these kind of globally immersive experiences. And while they're there, they're learning about the histories and the legacies of other cultures, and they're connecting that back to what they're learning locally in Detroit in school, regardless of whatever grade that they might be in. I think a lot of the travel tends to happen for students that are, teen-aged and up to graduation level. And then one of the things that Atlantic Impact is really great at is sort of subsidizing travel costs for kids, helping them passes and details like that when they're going abroad. And there's also a component of Atlantic Impact's program where they embed themselves into different schools within the Detroit public school system and have a curriculum or a series of instructional classes that kids are a part of. And through those, they go on experiential field trips locally where they focus on building their skills, gaining an understanding of what they might want to do post high school and into college, and getting other kinds of hard and soft skills here locally in Detroit. So it's a really great kind of experiential nonprofit that focuses the core of its energies on students. And they came to us because they were having a hard time communicating themselves to potential grant makers or foundations that they were seeking funds from to stay alive, essentially. A big part of the way that they subsidize their operations is through grants, local foundations, and by trying to promote themselves in a way where people hear about them and then individually donate to them so that they continue to do that good work. And they were having some difficult times being in rooms with funders where the explanation of what they did was really strong. Obviously, there was a very critical and valid need for what they were doing, and people could see that. But I think they were having a hard time bridging that gap from the explanation to the visual, where they now have to portray themselves as a very eligible and smart organization. And I think a lot of that is really conveyed through the visuals and the way the communication presents itself visually, not just orally in conversation. So they had a logo, which you see here, is just this kind of jumbly stack of type. And then they had this just sort of vernacular type and, the typical things that we're used to seeing when there's a scrappy organization trying to present themselves in a way that just makes sense. This is a still from a video where they're just trying to connect the trip that they took to Barbados and the work that they do in Detroit, the two flags from the different regions, and the students kind of grouped together there abroad traveling. So that's what they look like. And so when we were starting with them, I had some initial conversations about budget, as a lot of us always do, the always tricky conversation about budget. That's a separate talk in and of itself. If you need any tips, I'm happy to share. Please email me. And we decided to do a brand narrative workshop. Now, this is kind of a first for me because when I was coming up as a designer, I wasn't really taught to do these things. I was really just a set of hands in a lot of situations where I was coming up with the visuals, the logo, and very often I have a lot of strategy documents to guide what I was doing. This was at a very small studio. And so I was intrigued by this idea of getting the group collaboratively involved in construction of its brand. when we talk about ourselves, how do we talk about ourselves? Is everybody aligned and saying the same things about themselves? Are we all on the same page together when we talk about who we are as a company or an organization and a brand? And I use these experiences as a way of getting people into the room and orally hearing them talk about their organization. And then through some guided workshops and activities, doing some things to help streamline and build that narrative, as well as unpacking information that I didn't already know about the brand. So it comes directly from people. It feels very collaborative and respectful. And it's not me just working in a vacuum trying to cultivate information about the organization. So this is an example slide. That kind of, so, we always start off, we introduce ourselves. We talk about the goals for the workshop. So anytime you're doing a workshop, you want to very clearly at the very beginning state your goals. What are you here for? We're here to redefine our positioning. You could consider this a redefinition of your why or your core purpose. So then we explain those concepts, try to get people acclimated to exactly why are we sitting in this room together. And then we were equating that to all of these words that our industry uses. Some people say brand essence, brand promise, your core idea or your core truth, brand principles. These things all kind of mean the same thing. And the way that consultants like myself and other people use these words are sort of interchangeable. I think a lot of times it can be confusing to clients. And so we kind of define that. We try to break it down and simplify it. We simplify it into 6 questions. So first we ask, why are we here? Describe that. In this case, it's a simple statement. It sums up your core purpose. It's usually emotional in tone. It's simplified to a few headlines. So it's essentially like, what do we stand for? What do we do? How do we do it? What makes us different? Who are we? And who are we here for, I should say? What do we value the most as an organization? And then what's our personality? And so these questions seem really simple on the surface, but they provoke a surprising amount of dialogue, unstructured dialogue from a group, any group, especially groups that feel like they have a really emotional intimacy with their brand, like they really know it inside and out. But what you'll find in answering these questions is that everybody answers them the same way. You'll find that everybody has a very distinct and differing opinion. And so your job as a designer in these workshops is to try to facilitate that dialogue, to talk over each other, to connect things that are ideas or issues that are interrelated that come up from different people. Okay, well, you said this. So-and-so over here, what do you think of that? Do you agree with her? Can you expand a little bit more on that? And so that's I think the challenge of facilitating is having a more structured conversation that leads you somewhere. And as you're doing it, I would recommend having a colleague in the background taking notes, either orally recording it through some audio device, or just taking short notes on a whiteboard so that you can put them up and people can focus on those things as what they're saying starts to pour out into the room. And so we take those kinds of pillars and we think about them and we focus them into this sort of web of interconnectivity. And then we start to do a few other things. This is backtracking and looking at research. So, language-wise, what are we currently saying on the site that is and maybe is working? And so in order to do this, we looked at the current site. And this is kind of what they were saying. Preparing students for long-term success, Atlantic Impact equips students with the skills necessary to make significant and personal academic gains. I think to a lot of people, this statement would make sense. I think it's not granular enough. And I don't think it's saying a whole lot that's elevating the conversation or the point that exists behind it, Atlantic Impact's work. And then we're starting to look at some of the other visual tropes and things that appear on their homepage. Atlantic Impact exposes students to new opportunities through local and global travel. Again, that might make sense to a lot of people, but I don't really think it's describing how or why. There's a lot of things that are missing from this statement. If you look at some of the lower text, we bring living history into classrooms through our dynamic college level course experiences. We experience kind of the same things that I've been saying. I find the language to be a little bit complex and maybe a little bit reaching. And so is there a way that we can simplify this and make it more accessible to a broader audience? And then we continue to kind of examine and pick apart things. Again, this is my process. I'm not saying that this is a process that you need to adopt for yourself. This is just some of the things that we've done in the past. And so this led us to a SWOT analysis. It's sort of a simple exercise. It's strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And so we projected this on a whiteboard, and with Post-it notes had people kind of align different thoughts and ideas that poured out relative to this matrix. And we kind of wanted to see where certain thoughts and ideas and concerns were and how close they were to each other in terms of passing from one zone to another. This just gives us a visual read on the concerns that are rolling around in people's heads. Examples you may have seen. And so, you know, when we're talking about the simplicity of brands and kind of what we're trying to do, we're trying to take what is depictive of the brand visually and verbally and boil it down into something simple and memorable. So we are showing them brands like FedEx, not that these are at all related to what Atlantic Impact does within their industry, but it's a way of using something that's familiar and within the cultural zeitgeist or whatever. People see this logo all the time, so they kind of have an innate understanding of it. And we start pairing these logos with some of their positioning statements. So in this case, Starbucks, which is one that we all know in a little bit. I don't think a lot of us actually know the statement, but it says, to inspire and nurture the human spirit, one person, one cup, and one neighborhood at a time. So is there something that we can start to develop for Atlantic Impact that brings about the same attitude, point of view, and spirit? Coca-Cola brings joy. It's happiness in a bottle. Oxfam. In a world rich in resources, poverty isn't inevitable, it's an injustice which can and must be overcome. And so we do exercises. In this case, this is exercise 1. 5 to 7 words or less, 2 people per group. In 5 to 7 words, describe why you're here. Why does your organization exist? What's the core purpose? And generate 3 unique why statements and write them down. So we give people time. We do a lunch break because at this point in the day, this might have been an hour plus, people get kind of bored, and there's a lot of research to suggest that when you break things up into distinct periods of like rest and productivity, you get more engagement and you get more thought. So we give people lunch break, we come back, we answer those questions, and we keep going. And I could show you believe me, there are tons and tons of things on it. For the sake of time and because I want to get through a lot of my other slides, I'm not going to show them all to you, but just know that we have this workshop as a way of mining information in a very respectful way from our organizations, giving them the opportunity in their own words to collaborate with us in the design process. And it's also a moment where you're building trust and a rapport with the client, especially the client if it's more than one stakeholder. If it's the executive director of a nonprofit in this case, their support staff, and some of the students themselves. In this case, that's how we approached it with Atlantic Impact. There are students and there are adult program leaders, and we wanted both perspectives at the table. So that's what we did. Anytime that you do a workshop, I would recommend between 5 and 7 people. If it gets more than that, the room starts to get a little bit more unwieldy. It's hard to wrangle everybody, really facilitate. So you want to make sure that you are holding court, giving people the space to talk and collaborate, but not so much where these conversations become unproductive. So I'm not going to go any deeper into these slides, but you can kind of get an idea. There's a rhythm, there's part 1, part 2, part 3. And if you're really curious about seeing these, for those of you that are watching, just reach out to me. I'm happy to share some slightly censored slides. The bulk of it will be there, but there might be some sensitive things that I have to take out. So we move on from that workshop into, oh yeah, and I should also say a lot of the techniques that I learned for this workshop and how to structure it are found in this book. So this is Michael Johnson, Branding in 5.5 Steps. It's a really great book. It was written about 3-4-ish years ago by a firm that does a lot of mission-driven work in the UK for charities and things like that. and it's witty and it's accessible. And it gives techniques for trying to run effective workshops and brand engagements without being too prescriptive. So definitely go and look that up. You can find it at johnsonbanks.co.uk, or you can get it on Amazon or a place like Powell's in Oregon. But that takes us into the actual branding. So when we get to the actual branding stage, we've done our research, we've done our workshops, we've asked the questions, we've passed half a dozen calls and emails back and forth. We get into the mode where we're really starting to design. I usually create pitch presentations. I think these vary for everybody. In fact, I think there's going to be a lot of you out there that do it way better than me. And you might even disagree with the way that we do it, or just think that we should be doing it better. And I would love to hear that feedback. I'm doing what has worked well for me, and it's what I've had to do over several years of being a designer. I think at this point I'm in my 14th year, but not all of those years have been spent in the strategy seat. So I think I'm still very much learning too. So we start this way. I always like to start with a joke or something. And so in this case, I was taking this meme that I found on Twitter one day, and I was using it as a primer for the client. I was saying, you know, whatever you see in this presentation, don't pick it apart to the point where it becomes unuseful. Like, give it a moment so that you can live with it, let it kind of knock around in your brain a bit, see how you adapt to it and what's being shown. And then if it's really something that you're not pleased with or happy with, we can obviously talk about it, but this is just a sort of playful jab to let people know that like what we're about to show needs some time. And so don't just pick it apart immediately, you know, live with it. And so we started by doing a lot of visual research. We looked at visual tropes in the landscape of education. In this case, for experiential travel for students, we looked at a lot of brands, and the yellow highlights that you see are all of the things that we found similarities in. In this case, a lot of brands use globes. It's a very big visual trope when we're talking about travel and education. You can imagine the globe and a child's classroom as a tool of education. This seems to be something that this industry references a lot. So we learned a lot from this exercise. Next, airplanes, obviously. Again, talking about travel, whether it's youth-related travel or just globally experiential travel, airplanes are something that are very big, whether it's a paper airplane, an actual airplane, or an abstract icon of an airplane. Acronyms. So there's a lot of travel organizations, youth-centered or not, that just use acronyms as the within the name. At a glance, if you've never had any experience with this and all you see are 4 or 5 big letter forms, maybe even 3, this doesn't have much resonant value. So for us, through this exercise, I think we began to understand that Atlantic Impact, it was really important for them to not go by an acronym, but to say their name in full so that they could build brand recognition around that name over time. And the swoosh line, the ever-present swoosh line, swooshes, arcs, ill-conceived or not, they're all there. Compasses, you know, this idea of navigation and directional travel. Less so in this research, but still there in some form. And then we start by telling the client that I think the goal of this for us is to really create a symbol or a mark that's really simple, and therefore a brand, although I would say this brand isn't very simple, to create some kind of mark that's easily identifiable. And so we start by showing them examples. So what do we mean when we say that? So let's think about some of the most recent things that we can remember. And this was several years ago. So this was back when the Hillary logo, for designers in this room who remember, with the arrow, was a bit of a controversy for a week, and then everybody forgot about it and no one cared anymore. But this is a very early version of the Hillary logo. And then we show the simplified version, which is this. We show ACLU, which was designed by Sylvia Harris, who's no longer with us. Another design hero of mine. If you haven't looked her up, you should really look her up. Sylvia Harris. Anyway, this logo is no longer around. now you now have the ACLU, it's been simplified. And so this is a trend that we're seeing with brands, the simplification of visual language. And so how do you evolve a symbol? We started talking about the evolution of symbols. So this is the campaign for Black male achievement. The logo is the slightly simplified version. The bottom is the before version. I believe this work was done by Hyperact, based in Brooklyn. American Spoon, a really popular culinary name, taking something that is already somewhat recognizable and refining the typography and the symbolism. By the way, these are designed by Luis Fili. A gelato ice cream place. Again, can we take something that is maybe a little bit complex or isn't really holding up well and turn it into something that has more spirit, attitude, and symmetry? Again, Luis Fili with the good housekeeping symbol, something that we've seen on products for decades. It's gone through quite an evolution, and it just points back to the fact that brands are simplifying more than ever, especially visually. I should say brand identity is not just brands. I would actually say this is more complex, but what it does is it brings out the spirit of the product and the company in a stronger way. So then we go and we start thinking about the logo itself. The earliest iterations of the logo we didn't even have. We had to go through the Internet Archive, archive.org, find old versions of the website on search engines, and then actually extract this information. So the clients had not thought about this in so long that they could not actually find the files to give us a visual history of the logo. So we went and found it ourselves, and this is what we found. So you can see it's lowercase letter forms. It feels friendly, approachable. This is made in between 2020 and 12. The colors are a little corporate for, I think, what the brand is trying to convey. And then this is the most recent version, the one that we redesigned once the brand was finished. So they had simplified it a little bit. They had gone the trope route. All of the research that we just did shows that this is just now more dominant than ever, the fact that they've reinforced this. Not that it was very connected to what they were trying to do and say about their brand. So it made sense, I think. But again, you have this paper airplane and you've got kind of uppercase, kind of very strong type. And I think it conveys the sense of professionalism, but there's not a lot of playfulness or spontaneity. You know, we're talking about youth, and youth are attracted to, you know, I don't know if you consider yourselves youths anymore. I feel like I'm slowly aging beyond a point of not completely understanding people that are in their 20s or lower, but I'm still trying really hard. And so, you know, I think people who are in that age bracket are really enchanted with and delighted by visuals that are not this. And I think that's pretty evident when you look at the landscape of brands for that, that demographic. You don't really see this a lot. And so, you know, we started to look at the comparative landscape. People out there that are very similar to Atlantic Impact that kind of do what they do, but do it in a different way. So the first was Build On. And so we did an audit of their communications, looking at everything from buttons to colors to symbols to typography, photography, the use of photography. So you get this very real sense of the reality of that people are living using these full color images with action-oriented focus and compositions, you know, sometimes that are very soft depth of field. We couldn't quite figure out what the mark meant. Maybe it's the confluence of a lot of people coming together. It's kind of a mystery. Global potential. We thought this was very interesting because the logo looked like earpods or earbuds for the iPhone or just any music player. And again, you get this sort of full color, black and white, stark, smiling imagery. Typography is a little unrefined. Global glimpse. This is what they look like. So again, it's this idea of like 4 different shapes kind of coming together to create a whole. You get very strong 4-color photography. There is not a whole lot of brand consistency between type, color, and the way it's being conveyed, and the messaging isn't very clear or descriptive. So then we took all of these brands that we had researched and we plotted them on a color spectrum, and we started to think, like, where do all of these brands live in the continuum of color? And this is what we found. A lot of them live overwhelmingly in blue. Few of them live in green. There's more action in the orange and yellow spectrums, but those in-between spaces, especially pink and purple, an area that people don't tend to go in this industry, either because all of the other industries and brands are mimicking their peers, or because nobody has held the thought to try to do something intentionally to differentiate themselves. These four palettes as both dominant and sort of underutilized. And then, the confluence of all of these things together create black, which sits at the sort of the nexus of the color sphere. And we started to think about typography, and everything that we had observed in our research, we saw that there was a lot of use of friendly sans serifs. And so we thought that there was something to that, and we wanted to stick with that. So we started to look for typefaces that conveyed the spirit and attitude we were looking for the brand. We settled on Arquitecta, which is a great typeface designed by Latino Type, and another typeface by Latino Type that's somewhat complementary and has these exaggerated upper-lower case styles called Keyulat. I actually don't know how to pronounce that, so don't hold me to that. And we started to test it and set it in different ways. And then photography, we started to, sorry about that. We actually commissioned photographers. We knew that from our early conversations with the brand, they had no imagery and they were only using stock photography. And so we had this idea, since youth are going on global excursions, we wanted to show youth in the context of an urban environment. So I commissioned my good friends, Michelle and Chris Gerard. Some of you on this Zoom call might know them already. They're local photographers. They are fantastic. And I work with them as often as I can. And I gave them the parameters. I said, I want you to photograph youth in a very perceptive and observational style. I want it to be in the context of a city environment. And I want it to look like they're traveling through these different worlds and having different experiences together. And then I just sort of cut them loose. And so this is what they came back with. So we had built intentionally an image library. And the reason that we did this is because we knew post-involvement with Good Done Daily, this brand was going to need to be able to represent themselves visually so that they could bring in new audiences, new teenagers who wanted to be a part of the programming, or new adults who maybe wanted to be program leaders or advisors. And if we could show them, if we could show pictures of people who are like them and maybe convey a similar spirit or attitude, people might feel more connected to this. So that's why we did photography. Oops, sorry, that's a little bit too early. I just kind of gave it away, but let's go back for a second. Okay. Study of logo and iconography. So now we get to the actual logo. We're thinking about all kinds of things. So this is the Atlantic Impact logo. It's this kind of rigid, angular, it's this rigid represents travel and flight and direction and mobility. And then we started to think about the actual dimensionality of this paper airplane. When you tilt it and look at it from a different perspective, it starts to adapt very letter form characteristics. It looks kind of like an A, and there's an A in Atlantic Impact. So we like this idea of the relationship there. But when we think about education, education is very flexible, and paper, like a paper airplane, is very flexible. It's meant to sort of bend and kind of move through the air. It's very mobile, and it can kind of follow a path from A to B. And so that was kind of interesting, this flexibility in education. And then when you talk about education, where are people getting information? A lot of times it's from computers and laptops now, but in the Detroit school system, it's still very much through books. And so starts to be this connection between like the flexibility of paper, books that bend, and kind of coal all of these different things together. So you can see here, the bend of a book kind of represents the bend of the paper in a paper airplane. But then, as I said earlier, this kind of reminds us of an A. And if you look at the gestalt, the negative space in an A, what does that remind you of? Kind of reminds you of a pencil. So this is a sort of visual artifact or a trope of education. You know, the yellow pencil, the color yellow itself. You could think of yellow school buses and travel when you're trying to get kids to school. So we looked at all of these different interesting relationships that exist within just the shape of a paper airplane. And we started to put all of those things together. And we came up with this. So not everybody is going to see all of these things in it. In fact, the majority of Atlantic Impact's audience won't notice many of these things, but it's the upward mobility and direction of a paper airplane. So sort of representing this idea of upward. The program is about for youth. It's this idea of education. It's the idea of the name itself, the A being a very strong identifier of the brand. And then if you look at the gestalt, you can either see the A or you can choose to see the book or the pencil. And I think baking all of these things, as far as meaning into the mark, however stacked it might be, was really intriguing to Atlantic Impact and made them really love it and feel attached to it because it was unique and not something that anyone else in their space could replicate very easily. So that was our reasoning for that. And then we started to think about visual language, so shape. If you look at the Atlantic Impact logo, there are these kind of delicious little geometric shapes. There's the triangle, and if you look at the dot, you know, right here, you get the triangle, but then if you look at the dot in Atlantic Impact, you get this circle. And these are very elemental shapes. So is there a way of extracting these and turning that into visual language for brand? We're thinking about patterns. So, you know, when kids are at school, they're taking notes. Again, this is a kind of emblematic of my own experiences being in school. I was always taking notes. I think a lot of things are done very digitally nowadays, but in school systems that are under-resourced, kids are just working with pen and paper and notebooks still. And so thinking about the form of that, the fact that, you know, structured lines provide spaces for kids to put their thoughts down, their ideas and notes. We like that idea. And then the texture of the pages themselves. Sometimes there's crumpled paper, sometimes there's grittiness in the paper, highlighted forms and things that are circled. Texture, you know, when I was in school, and maybe a lot of you are guilty of this, I always drew in the margins of my paper. I still have teenage relatives and who do this when I'm looking at projects that they've done at school or kind of helping them with homework. I see this kind of gesture appear over and over, this active mark making. It's sort of the when your mind sort of veg, sometimes you're just sort of drawing in the corner. So we like that idea too. And then collage, this idea that all of these global experiences that students have are sort of this patchwork. They all come together to form one whole. So kids are traveling, they're going out on daily excursions, they're learning, they're having these different experiences and they collage together to create one memory that informs how they might approach their achievement later on, approach their career, approach how they engage in education when they return home. So we like this idea of the collage. And then again, collage of global experiences. So what you see here is that very patchwork at work here. It's these different things that kids are experiencing in the field as they go about their travel. And so when you put all of those things together, shape, pattern, collage, you get something like this. So this is the system that we came up with for the typography and the brand language. Ironically, these were just never produced. These were just sort of speculative to show the identity applied to something. So I sometimes like to use fake report covers or things to convey all of the elements. If you're looking for something quicker, you can just develop a social media asset like an avatar or a cover image, because that is also a great way of bringing all of your brand elements together to show a client a quick application so they start to get an idea of how the identity lives. So we always do things like this. This uses the photography, the colors, the tone, and it conveys the spirit. And we start to think about collateral. You know, when you spread these things out, how do they start to hold together? Is there consistency between the forms? When we get into things like business cards, they've got several different academic leaders. And so we like this idea of letting the business cards back be different each time, having the colors that we identified earlier being represented on the backs of these cards, and then rotating and kind of recomposing these shapes so that every time you hand something new out, it's a different experience. It's new, and it feels evergreen, kind of. And just an example of the way that the cards are. For one of the backs of the cards, we deconstructed and did a collage. And one of the things that we know about this program is that there are sub-brands. In fact, there are 3. And so the colors that we identified earlier in the presentation, which I showed you, we knew that we were gonna apply these colors to these key areas. And so in this case, they already had the names determined. There was a little bit of, maybe we'll help them write those, but ultimately I think we decided to stick with what they had already had. So there's Our Town, Our World, and Our World Fellows. And these are different levels of programming that students of certain ages pass through. Our World Fellows, for example, is when people who went through Atlantic Impact's programming return to kind of be youth mentors. And so creating a system that was very structured. You know, the slash isn't just there because it's there, it's measured exactly to the proportions of the type and the symbol. And these things have a certain level of clear space around them, and everything is very considered. And then, you know, it's not just enough to say Our Town because it doesn't have any association, at least for people who have never seen the brand, to the actual brand. So having an identifier that anchors to the bottom, that as you shrink it or expand it, the type is still legible. So we did a lot of testing with things like that. And then this has to live in a variety of spaces. Twitter, what does it look like on Twitter? I think for these, we found, we use Sketch, which is a user experience design tool, and we found a template for Twitter and just customized the colors and things very quickly to give the client an idea of what was going on. And this is kind of before Twitter changed, but you still get the idea. And what does that look like in mobile when you condense it down on your cell phone? It's primarily the way people experience things these days. So you always have to think very mobile friendly and show it, you know, if you can, in a phone. Facebook, kind of the same issue. You know, we did different cover images. They could, at any time, switch these out as they saw fit. And then we started to think about branded apparel. So using some of the photos that we took, we quickly photoshopped in some things to try to make the client really see the potential of this in other mediums than just the screen. And so that is a thank you for that, but I have some other things to continue to go. So the client ultimately liked this, they approved it. And, you know, we went through some iterative tweaks, as you can see here. This is very different than what we ended up with. You can see here that it's a little bit more balanced in terms of the people who are represented, men and women in this case. That was really important to them. And so over here, it's really weighted as being predominantly female. And so we wanted to just try to create more balance and, you know, make sure that we're representing as many different perspectives and ages as we can in their programming. And so that was really important to them. We wanted to hear them out on that. And so from a duotone image, which is a little bit more abstract and hard to read, to just 4-color images, I wanted something that was a little bit off kilter for the brand. I know that everything that we've done is very clean and typographically centered, but there was something about the spirit of people that this is a very human brand. It was centered around the needs of youth. And there was this idea of scribbles and kind of hand gestures and mark making. And at the time I was really obsessed with Procreate on the iPad, and I had been doing a lot of hand lettering. And so I wrote this out one day. And I really liked how it looked. And so I started working it into the layout. I was really hoping that the client wouldn't make me change it. And to their credit, they let us keep this handwriting because we think for a poster, for something that's very expressive that gets hung up in classrooms or in hallways of schools to encourage students to join the program, this reaches out and touches someone in a way that more geometric typography might not immediately, because that tends to blend into the environment of communications. And so this was a poster that also doubled as a mailer. It could be used in a lot of different ways. You could open it up firstly as just a quick 2-page one spread guide. You could look at it as a poster on a wall, or you could mail it out. And when you mailed it out folded flat, you would see the cover of this first. We also worked on some language. So we wrote the title, A Leader in City-Centered Field Trips and Globally Immersive Travel for Students. I still don't know if this was the best way to write it. And I think I went through quite a few iterations. You know, we could always do better, but this ended up being something that they felt very happy with. So we kept it. And, you know, when I'm showing them, the client, these things in subsequent versions, I always mark up our presentations with our thoughts so that they can read why we did something, what it means, and kind of experience, especially if I can't be in the room presenting it to them, as was the case with this project. And you'll find that is common on a lot of projects. Sometimes you can't be there for everything. You can try, but sometimes you have to do your best to convey your thoughts when you're not in the room. And so this is what it became. We also thought about the idea of mark making and scribbles, and we like this idea of animating the mark. So we played around with that because we knew it was going to have to live on the website in some way. And so we thought, what if this could somehow live on the website? So we tried this. And this is actually the real Atlantic Impact Facebook page. So you can see some of our brand assets kind of in action right now. And they still use it to their credit. And just showing you some of the images that we commissioned. I will tell you one of the things that I learned, having not commissioned a lot point, was when you're commissioning photography and actually setting the terms of art direction, you need to be there as often as possible. The relationship that I have with Michelle and Chris Gerard, who are really great photographers, is I trust them for the most part. I know that they're going to give me back what I want because I have such a respect and trust in the work that they do, and I have a familiarity with it. But there were a lot of things that I could have prevented if I was there in the field. You'll notice a lot of students have these food boxes. They were downtown and they had gone out to lunch and they were dragging them everywhere. And so I had to find creative ways to crop this out or Photoshop it out, which created more work on my end. So anytime you can be there, actively guarding and art directing, you should definitely take the opportunity. Don't be as passive as I was. But we ended up getting some really great shots of kids and students and youth in these fantastic urban environments. This was particularly occurring to me. You can see here that shelter to home on her shirt is very prominent. I had to Photoshop this out and I had to find creative ways of cropping out these food boxes, which is always an interesting challenge. And it's this idea of students having experiences together, this idea of togetherness and understanding one another, and showing, frankly, a lot of racial diversity and accurately representing the audience. I mean, they may have people who are youth advisors who are not Black or identify as Black, but we wanted to overwhelmingly focus on the students and kind of have some of these supervisors to the background because this is a program about them. Pictures of students on the Detroit riverfront. You can see more food photos. My bad. So learn from my mistake. We delivered, as a lot of us do, style guides. I actually have a contentious relationship with style guides because I think they don't matter. And I'll tell you why. I don't think that they matter. You can work on a brand really hard. You can do everything right as you've been taught to do it. And you can equip the client with those guidelines. If that client does not make the investment in an ongoing relationship with you to provide design, or if that client does not have in-house design talent, as many struggling nonprofits don't, very often that brand is not going to get implemented the right way. Now, there's a lot of arguments for creating user-friendly materials and assets that people can build, like a kit of parts or Legos. Even designers and people who are not very gifted at that, just giving them simple elements allows them to do that. And I'm in complete agreement with that. You should, to the extent that you can and to the extent that the budget allows. But often for smaller organizations, your clients don't have time to do that. And they're gonna, in my experience, relegate that work to interns or staff members that are lower on the totem pole. And those people are moving quickly a lot of the times. Nonprofits are scrappy. They're trying to get their communications out yesterday. And so they're not always going to do a very good job maintaining or stewarding the consistency of the brand. That's just my opinion. That is no jab against Atlantic Impact. They do the absolute best they can, and they work really hard at delivering the programs that they develop. And I do believe they care about these things. But there's also something to be said for lack of talent or in-house resources, and that can have an impact on how the brand looks and ages over time. So those are just some opinions and things to be aware of when you do this work for these kinds of organizations. And if you can, you might try and strike a deal with them or do a low-cost retainer where they get X amount of hours per month and you provide X amount of deliverables per month or per year, so that you can continue the relationship and they can pay a stipend and you're able to kind of maintain the consistency of those elements over time. That's always a good way to try to approach the conversation with clients too. It doesn't work every time, but it can be a really positive way to go about things. These are just guidelines that we wrote for how to use the brand, how to construct elements and things like that. And like I said, you can try really hard and sometimes places are just moving really quickly. So you'll get a partial adoption of the brand where the colors and scribbles, but you'll wonder where sometimes things like typography comes from. These are not fonts that we specified, but they're the fonts that they had in that moment. And so they're doing what they can with the elements that we've given them. Sometimes you'll see things like this. And you'll have your moment and then you'll get over yourself and you'll go back to doing the best work that you can do. But by and large, we love this client. They were exceptionally patient with us. There were a few rubs along the way, but through dialogue and a proper relationship, we were able to, I think, put something on the table for them that they were really proud of. And then just briefly before I wrap this up, I'll show you something real quick. So this is the website that we ended up creating for them. This work was done by my colleague Ruder, who took a lot of the design elements and made them interactive. And so it was this idea of layers. As you've seen a lot of our work, it's very layered and collage. So as you scroll, things slowly move in a very subtle parallax. And, interactive gestures for buttons and hover states. I talked about the animation of the logo earlier. When you hover over, the logo does this very subtle thing that maybe no one will notice, but I think is kind of interesting. And so for our projects, we have this tendency to always hide something special in the logo. So if you end up looking at our site and looking at any of the websites we've done, sometimes the logo will kind of surprise you. We don't usually tell our clients, we just do that and see if they notice. And then when you click the menu, Randy did this amazing job of illustrating icons and animating in the style of the logo itself. This kind of scribbly effect. And we really like this. So all done in WordPress, and it was an interesting challenge. It took longer than it should have, but I think ultimately we're pretty happy with it still. Share screen, go back to this. And so, that is really it. I hope this was helpful. I know that this is a very specific way for us and how we do things. I'm sure there are many of you out there that do them slightly differently or do it better than us. And I would love to hear from you if you have tips that you'd like to share with us. Likewise, if any of the assets you saw are things you'd like to look at in more detail. To the extent that I can, I will share a slightly moderated version of materials, but you'll have to reach out to me independently for those things. So with that, I'll shut up and kind of let Maria and Dylan see.
Thank you, Andy. Great presentation on branding. And also, I think as far as what you mentioned too with the style guides, I definitely agree with that, because especially with smaller companies, you can provide them with, you know, the assets that they need and all of that, but having something that's a brief, you know, kind of just maybe 2-page guide like you've shown here on screen, I think is great. Just something for them to easily follow. I know there was a lot of great information shared, so I know there's some feedback in the chat, so thanking you for your time. And it looks like we do have one question that Anne submitted. Anne asks, when you say it took longer than it should have, how long should it have taken and how long did it take?
So this was 3 or 4 years ago, 3 years ago. It took the better part of a little over a year. I know that sounds very pronounced, but I will be honest and say that it was somewhat mismanaged by me. There were some communication issues with the client where we would try to be forthright with them and we wouldn't hear back for weeks on end. We'd try to get feedback. I'd have to be much more direct with them through calls or in-person meetings when possible. But then there were also opportunities where Good Done Daily was just really busy, and I was, to be honest with you, having a hard time keeping it all settled and straight and project managed. And so some of it was my fault and some of it was the client. And so what I say to mitigate those problems is, when you're not getting an answer, don't wait for it to arrive via email. Reach out to people by phone and have weekly, bi-weekly, or at least twice a month check-ins to update progress, because that's what keeps everybody accountable.
Yeah, great advice. There was a question here in chat, Andy. Josette wants to know, could you remind us of your book recommendation? I think it was related to the steps that you use in your initial meeting with the client.
Yeah, so this is called Branding in 5.5 Steps. Josette is one of my best friends. I've known her since high school or before. So it's really good to see you out there in the virtual world, Josette. But yeah, this is the book that I recommend reading. It's a very fascinating kind of visual continuum of like branding. How did we get to such a confusing state of so many different terms that all mean the same thing? It's very witty and filled with humor, but also pragmatic advice for structuring the exploration and development of a brand.
Nice.
Andy, I have one question. So when you were presenting this work, we were kind of seeing like the finished product. And when I've had to do branding work and things like that before, you typically go through a process of like showing logos in progress and like, do you like this direction? Do you like that direction? How do you manage that sort of interaction where you're trying to like lead them down different paths or like figure out what they want and like incorporate ideas into it?
Oh, that's such a great question. So this was an unusual project and it was a little bit goalsy of me, but this was a very low funded project and we probably completely blew the budget on this one. So that's another secret that you might not hear the client mention, but I will be transparent with you on that. We learned a lot. I decided to present one identity and one logo on this. And it was because I knew that the budget was just so thin that for me to overextend and do more work was going to be harder. And so I thought if we could just name it, process and resourced examples, that we could probably get the client on board. And that's thankfully what ended up happening. But the way that I typically will run these engagements is I'll do at least 3 alternating and contrasting ideas. And I try not to go overboard. I think a lot of designers will try to show it in every possible permutation. I have designed 3 distinctly different concepts. Here is a litany of ways that they can exist with the brands applied to real world things, and they end up creating dozens and dozens of assets. Well, we're a studio of 2, sometimes 4 right now, sometimes 5 or 6, depending on our freelancers. And we try to do a lot of this brand work in-house if we can. We're also working on several other projects. So when we're creating 3 distinct brand marks, these might be logos, those are differentiating assets, but then we'll take something like a cover image or an avatar or a speculative cover or something and apply the brand to it in one very simple but strong way. And show that. And usually that's enough to convey the spirit and the tone of how the rest of the brand could manifest, whether we choose that direction or another. And so that's kind of how I've managed to do it. But I would love to hear how other people in the audience have done it, because that part, like you, Dylan, fascinates me. And I feel like I've not quite figured it out. You know, Good Done Daily isn't Pentagram. So we don't have the same resources, time, or budgets to make a lot of that work.
Yeah, I had a professor in college specifically say, I do 3 logos. I give them first the logo they think they want, the logo that I want, and then finally the one that is just okay. And they'll always pick the second one because it's the second one I present. So it's really
that's very smart. Actually, it's manipulative. I like that.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, thank you, Andy. Thank you, Dylan. And it looks like we have a couple more questions here. One question asks, when your logo clicks, what is done to ensure a version doesn't already exist by another company?
Oh, that's a good question. So I think that's part of the reason why we do so much industry-specific research at the beginning of our presentations, where we're doing a comparative analysis of other logos that exist within that industry. That's our way of trying to make sure that we're not replicating tropes or things that are so often used or recycled that we're being derivative of something that already exists. Now, having said that, is an airplane icon the most original thing in the world? No. A lot of companies and organizations, even outside of educational travel, use that symbol. So I think for us, it was about understanding that very early on through the process of research, and then figuring out a way to construct that and very different from everything else in the landscape. So always start with your research, and you're never going to be able to see everything in the world, whether you Google image it or whatever, but you really try to do your best. And if there is a copyright issue later on, and you're working for a very big client before it even gets to that point, make sure that you pass it through an attorney or a copyright attorney. Very often with larger budget projects, there's room for that work to be done. And if there isn't, it's something that you as a designer can suggest.
Thank you, Andy. And then related to that, for the copyright attorney and passing that along, could you talk a little bit about that, maybe even from personal experience? Like, how would that work? Does the client pay that upfront, or is that something that you would bill the client for?
So I think in our earliest conversations with a client, if we know that there's a lot of money to invest, and I'll be honest with you, we haven't actually gone through these experiences on a personal level as Good Done Daily, but I know other practitioners who have. And so I'll use the examples that they gave me. If your client has a lot of money and time to invest in this work, bring that up and set expectations very early on, first or second meeting. Don't let it be a surprise later in the process, because the costs of that are, the cost of that as a surprise later on can be a turnoff to the client. So bring it up earlier, discuss those things. And if you happen to have local resources that you can point your client to early on, point them to that so that they can factor that into the budgeted costs of doing the work.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you. And then there's another question here that asks, do you typically assign one designer to come up with the brand elements for each client, or do you work together as a studio to put these together?
It's a nice question. We do both. We do it in both ways. Sometimes the work that comes into the studio is about whoever picks up the phone and has the most rapport and repeat interactions with the client. And in most cases, it's me, because I run and own Good Done Daily. And I still try to design as much as I can. It's gotten a lot harder lately as we grow and take on bigger projects. So a lot of my work is, at least it feels like 60% management and 40% or so design. You know, with Randy, my colleague who's there with me day to day, sometimes it's me developing things and showing him, and then him influencing the process. He'll say, you know, I don't really think that treatment of the typeface is appropriate, or the palette that you're using conceptually doesn't make sense. What if you tried this? And so there's a lot of things that Randy has done to completely influence the trajectory of things. Sometimes though, as I grow and we get more, decided that it's better to set the creative direction, the parameters, hire the people that are really talented, and then back away and let them do the work. As long as I set the stylistic tone and direction and give a really clear creative brief to them, I try to keep it at 1 page or less with some resources and links. They can usually carry out the branding. And then what we do is we look at iterations of that. And I'm sort of a critical eye where I'm helping them to edit and hone in on the final version. And then I'm the one going into the room, presenting it and speaking more broadly about the concepts, because sometimes the freelancer can't be there.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And then, Andy, do you have a couple more minutes to answer these 2 other questions? I know we're already at an hour. Are you good?
Oh, yeah, I have as much time as you need.
Okay, thank you, Andy. Jocelyn has a question. Jocelyn writes, loved learning about your workshop process. How do you sell the client on a workshop and not just the traditional design process? Great question.
That's a good question. So we were smaller and even 3 years ago. And so when I took on this work, most of our projects I do for a flat rate. I know, having done design for many years now, what something will cost, and I don't charge hourly in a lot of cases, unless it's a really special case. So we charged a very low flat rate for all of this work, which was all inclusive of everything that you've seen. And I didn't have any intention at the beginning of doing this, but I felt like it would be a great way of building rapport and trust. So I spent the extra time. Now, when we're into these projects, I think about that from the very beginning. We just did a strategy workshop remotely through Zoom and a few online sharing tools a few weeks ago. And when I was pricing that project out, I thought about that completely. I thought about the research, the time, the facilitation, and the post workshop follow-up. And I baked that into the cost for a flat fee. So, you know, I think the key is to not focus on that as a thing, like a special thing that you're mixing into the process. You're a practitioner. This is your all-inclusive process. They don't necessarily need to know that at the very beginning. You can put it in the itemized scope of work that you send in that estimate or invoice. It can be in there. If they have questions about it, great, but you're the professional. You know what you need to do to get your work done professionally and intelligently. So do the things that are necessary and don't let the client dictate what you can and can't do. If that's part of your process, do it. And if they can't afford to pay it, try to work out how you can minimize or boil the process down to be simpler, but don't completely redact it, because it's something that makes your work unique.
Andy, also as a follow-up to that, what do you do when someone kind of nickels, I don't say nickels and dimes, but they try to, maybe after you present them with your scope of work and they decide, well, we don't want to do like a strategy session, or, you know, however many rounds you want to include, or whatever else there is. How do you handle that? I know that comes up for me a lot as well.
That's a great question. So if you enter into an agreement at the beginning of a relationship with a client, and you know that maybe they're a struggling mission-driven organization, they don't have money, maybe their money that they have is $5,000, whatever, and they want printed assets and materials and a logo, you just have to be honest with them and say, for this amount of money, I can give you 1 mark, I'll give you up to 2 sets of changes, and I can give you 1 piece of printed collateral, but it needs to be less than 2 pages. You need to build and set those expectations. Don't give away your time and your creative for commensurate with the effort that you're putting in to do the work, especially pay. I'm really guilty of that and have been in the past. I've become less patient with that as I move forward and try to grow my own practice, because it's not a profitable way to grow ourselves, and it's not a way of growing our expertise. So just be honest with people and say, this is great what you have. We can help you and do this. It sounds like you might not be ready for this extra level of work. That's okay. We're going to be here for you when you are ready to make that decision. Let's revisit this conversation in 6 to 12 months. Never be afraid to tell people no, and never feel like you have to be so desperate that you'll do anything to get the work, because something will come along. If you're talented enough and you believe in the work that you're doing, people are going to notice that and come to you and hire you to do it for the money that you're worth. That's been my experience across the board.
Thank you, Andy. Yeah, that's really great advice. Appreciate the words of wisdom. There's a question here from Justine. Justine wants to know, did Good Done Daily set out to work primarily with nonprofits, or did it happen over time?
Thank you, Justine. Yes and no. So I had spent a good part of my early career as a design director at a local nonprofit that is no longer around, called Beehive. There's a case study on our website if you'd like to understand and learn more about that. And then I had worked in administrative at nonprofits, and I had worked at a studio that did a lot of commercial work, but also worked with a lot of mission-driven orgs and nonprofits. And that work was always, I was just always very drawn to that. And when I became the design director at Beehive, a lot of our work was based in the needs of community and talent retention and attraction. And I started to see how design could be used to shape people's experiences and conveying resources and information at a community level. And I really liked the idea that design could be used for something, in my opinion, that was more powerful than just straight up commerce. There isn't anything wrong with being a commercial designer, working in an ad agency. Those things are great, and that's what makes the commercial world go round, and the work is necessary. But it was not something that I felt attached to or passionate about. And so I struggled very hard to build a body of work around this, by just being very committed to it. And it wasn't always easy. And there's a whole other conversation about how much of this work you have to take on to make it as a studio, at least in Detroit. I won't speak for other areas of the country, but the market and what it will bear here tends to be very low. So yeah, it became that, and that's what we built our body of work around, and that's what people know us for. But we do the occasional commercial project to subsidize our smaller projects that bring us a little bit more joy. And I hope to eventually get up in the upper levels of that work, where we're working with bigger mission-driven orgs on thornier issues. Just hasn't quite happened yet.
Well, you're definitely there, Andy. So just keep going. And then it looks like there's one more question here. It's from Meg. Meg wants to know, I know you stated that you sometimes reach up to about 5 to 6 members at your studio. How many of these are designers, developers, photographers, etc., or is it just project-based things?
Oh, that's a great question, Meg. A lot of it is project-based. We have a network of people that I've worked really hard to develop over the years, relationships with other local designers, people who are similar and different in terms of their spirit, aesthetic. And these are people who are graphic designers and branding, identity, developers, especially when we need extra help. Although I will admit, my colleague Randy does a lot of that work because he's really gifted at interactive design for the web. I was trained as a print-based designer, so I tend to do a lot of work in branding and print media. And then, yeah, copywriting and photography. I hire independent practitioners on all of those projects. Right now, I think we've got about 7 projects going on in different states of completion, and we've got a copywriter on 2 actually. We've got a brand designer, a publication designer, and then a user experience designer for a website. And I'm trying to keep my shit together, and it's always a little bit hard. But yeah, that's what I have to do to try to make these things work, because if we tried to take it all in-house, it would just completely overwhelm my colleague and I. And so I've had to get back, decouple myself from everything and trusting other people and just hiring them to be good at what they're good at.
All right, thank you, Andy. So I know we're already almost at 1 o'clock, so I think we're going to wrap up here. And one last question, Andy, I have for you, for any students that are tuned in. Does Good Done Daily offer any internships, or how can they reach out to you, for a project? Maybe share a little bit about that.
Thanks for asking. Yeah, so we aren't doing a lot of internships right now. We've done some in the past. I don't know if any of you are on the call who were former interns, but in a weird way, a lot of our interns almost became like other members of staff, or they were doing as much work as Randy and I were, and that was a really great experience for them, and I think they appreciated that. At this moment, I can't take on interns, but I'm always interested in receiving portfolios because I do look at them and I do collect them. And I have reached out to people who have sent me an email a year ago to work on projects that we're doing now because they said something thoughtful or showed something really special in the work that I knew was the right fit for this project. So I'm constantly evaluating skills and trying to align them with the needs of the project. So no interns or internships right now, maybe in the future, but I'm happy to get emails. I always love answering questions. I love meeting for coffee. So if you want to meet for coffee, that's great. I can do a Zoom chat, a socially distant Zoom chat, and happy to look at portfolios too, and just try to reach out in those ways.
Okay, thank you, Andy. And there's also just some feedback here in chat. Jocelyn says, thank you for giving us an inside look into your process, Andy. The project turned out beautifully, super approachable and dynamic. And then Crystal Brower, she commented about intern. She goes, kind of, huh? And she says, it was great. I learned so much. So thank you for everybody who's tuned in and for your questions. Andy, thank you very much for taking us through your entire process. I think it was not only really insightful, but even just some of the things that you kind of expounded on just were really helpful to understand, how to approach things, takeaways of what I think all of us can maybe get better at when approaching a project, when working with a client, and really happy to have you back on the Zoom chat series. And I know your studio does some amazing branding work, so I was really happy to have you, focus on that and just kind of share and explore that a little bit further today in today's session. I know, to me, I learned a lot, and hopefully everybody that's tuned in here on Zoom, or if you were watching on Facebook Live, Twitter, or our YouTube channel, you appreciated the time spent here with Andy. And Andy, thank you again for your time, for sharing this information with our audience, and for the work that you're doing for the community. I always love seeing kind of your fingerprints on different things, and I don't know, it just definitely brings a lot of joy when I see it. So
yeah, and Dylan, thank you. And I should also write myself and say there's a lot of people that help us make this work. And I know I talked about them tangentially, but I should have had a slide with their names. And Crystal, who's in this chat, Crystal Brower, is one of those special people. So Crystal, thank you for being here and always being my cheerleader. I really appreciate it. And for those of you that you continue to support and contribute to the work that Good Done Daily does, we literally couldn't be here without you. And thank you for supporting my vision and allowing me to lead you, and always doing the most that you can when I give you creative feedback. And I'll end on this by saying that I think transparency in this profession is so rare, and so I think the only way we can learn from each other is when we open up and talk about the things that went right and the things that didn't. And I'm always happy to share, and I think that's how you'll learn. So I appreciate you giving me the opportunity. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Andy. Have a good rest of your day, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. We have 2 more Zoom chats tomorrow and Friday. So sign back in, register if you haven't already. But yes, thank you very much, Andy, and thank you for everyone for tuning in.
Okay. Have a good day, everyone.